I never thought my entire career would come down to a single digital signature. The conference room fell silent as Jack Preston, our new COO, leaned across the table with that smug grin. "Pick a paycheck, Marissa. Ours or your little evening gig." My heart hammered against my ribs as 15 executives watched. 5 years of perfect compliance work versus his 6 months of arrogance. I closed my laptop without a word. What Preston never understood about attestation specialists: we document everything. His downfall was already in motion. The morning after Preston's ultimatum, I arrived at Vertex Capital at 6:30, 2 hours before anyone else would be there. I needed quiet time to think through what had happened and plan my next move. The skyline of downtown Chicago was just beginning to glow with morning light as I sat at my desk, coffee in hand, reflecting on how quickly things had unraveled. 5 years ago, I had joined Vertex Capital as an entry-level compliance analyst fresh out of law school. The financial investment firm had been growing rapidly, and they needed someone who could navigate the increasingly complex regulatory environment. What started as a basic compliance role quickly evolved as I discovered I had a talent for understanding the intricate web of attestation requirements that investment firms had to meet. Attestations were legal certifications that specific procedures had been followed, and without them, the company could face massive fines or even criminal penalties. By my second year, I had created a streamlined attestation system that saved the company hundreds of hours of work while improving our regulatory standing. The CEO, Amanda Graham, had personally thanked me during the quarterly all-hands meeting, calling my work the invisible foundation that lets everyone else build with confidence. My promotion to compliance manager came in my 3rd year, giving me a team of 4 analysts to supervise. We handled everything from anti-money laundering procedures to investment disclosure requirements. I was proud of what we had built, a reputation for accuracy and integrity that other firms in Chicago envied. The evening consulting work had started almost by accident. My sister Lauren had nearly lost her small cafe when she unknowingly violated several municipal codes and health regulations. After helping her navigate the maze of compliance requirements, word spread among other small business owners. Soon I was spending 2 evenings a week helping local businesses with their regulatory challenges. It was rewarding work that Vertex had never objected to. In fact, Amanda had once called it community service that builds our reputation. Then Jack Preston arrived. The board hired him 6 months ago as the new chief operating officer with a mandate to streamline operations. Preston came from Lambert Financial, a larger competitor, with a reputation for aggressive cost-cutting. From his first week, I sensed his attention fixed on my department, not in a good way. "Compliance is a cost center," he said during his first executive meeting, looking directly at me, "and costs need justification." Within a month, he had slashed my department's budget by 20% without consultation. I lost 1 team member to resource reallocation, and our training budget disappeared entirely. "We're tightening belts everywhere," Preston told me when I objected. Nothing personal. But it felt personal, especially when I discovered that Preston had hired Ethan Davis, his former colleague from Lambert, as a special advisor with an office right next to mine. Davis had no compliance background, yet suddenly all my reports had to go through his review before reaching the executive team. I was working late one Tuesday when I noticed something unusual. Davis was accessing our secure attestation server, the system that housed all our legally binding certifications. As compliance manager, I received alerts for any unusual system access. Davis not only lacked the proper security clearance, but seemed to be downloading our entire attestation history. When I confronted him the next morning, his response sent a chill through me. "Jack asked me to conduct a thorough audit of all compliance functions," Davis said, not even looking up from his computer. "He feels there may be inefficiencies or conflicts of interest that need addressing." "Conflicts of interest? What exactly are you implying?" Davis finally looked at me, his expression neutral, but his eyes calculating. "Nothing specific yet. But I understand you have outside employment that could potentially compromise your objectivity when it comes to certain attestations." "My evening consulting work. They were using it against me." "That was disclosed and approved when I started it 3 years ago," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "There's full documentation in my HR file." "Policies change," Davis replied with a shrug. "Jack believes we need stricter boundaries." As I walked back to my office, the reality hit me hard. This wasn't about efficiency or conflicts of interest. Preston wanted me gone, and he was building a case against me. I just didn't understand why until later that afternoon when I received the system notification that would change everything. User J. Preston has modified attestation requirements for quarterly financial reporting. He wasn't just cutting costs, he was changing the rules. The next morning I started digging into our attestation records. What I found made my blood run cold. Several quarterly compliance documents that required my signature had been altered after submission. The changes were subtle, but significant risk exposure levels adjusted, disclosures modified, attestation language softened. These weren't clerical errors. They were deliberate changes that could put the entire firm at legal risk. I pulled up the original files from my secure backup system, a practice I had started when Preston first arrived. The discrepancies were clear. Someone had modified official records after my attestation, which was not just unethical but potentially criminal. I needed advice from someone I trusted, so I scheduled a confidential lunch with Caroline Walsh, Vertex's general counsel. Caroline had been with the company for 15 years and had hired me originally. At 57, with her trademark silver bob and penetrating blue eyes, she was the moral compass of the executive team. "Be extremely careful, Marissa," she warned as we sat in a quiet corner of a restaurant 3 blocks from the office. "What you're describing is serious, but Preston has the board's complete confidence right now. But if documents are being altered after attestation, that puts the whole company at risk," I insisted. "And it makes me personally liable since my signature is on them." Caroline nodded grimly. "Which is precisely why you need to protect yourself first. Document everything. Create timestamps. Keep records of all communications, but do it quietly." "You think Preston is deliberately targeting me?" "I think," Caroline said carefully, "that when someone new comes into power, they often want their own people in key positions. Your role controls access to information that could be inconvenient." Following Caroline's advice, I implemented an aggressive documentation strategy. Every attestation I submitted now had invisible watermarks and timestamps. I stored copies on encrypted drives and sent blind carbon copies to my personal email using encoding that would register if they were altered. I also began researching Preston's background. A former colleague in the industry shared interesting information. Preston's departure from Lambert Financial had been described as part of a restructuring, but rumors suggested he had left just weeks before a major compliance issue came to light. Nothing had been proven, but the timing was suspicious. 2 weeks later, I sat silently fuming during an executive board meeting as Preston presented the quarterly compliance metrics. The numbers he showed bore little resemblance to what my team had actually reported. Our risk exposure was significantly understated, and several regulatory issues were completely omitted. After the meeting, I followed Preston to his office, my laptop clutched to my chest containing proof of the discrepancies. "Do you have a minute to discuss the quarterly compliance report?" I asked, keeping my tone professional despite the anger simmering beneath. Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Marissa. Always time for our compliance expert." Once the door closed, I opened my laptop and showed him the comparison between my original report and what he had presented. "There are significant discrepancies here that need to be corrected before the official filing," I said. "I'm concerned about the regulatory implications." Preston's facade dropped instantly. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that the numbers presented today don't match our actual compliance metrics. I'm offering to help correct them before the filing deadline." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with cold calculation. "You know, Marissa, I've been meaning to discuss something with you. Your outside consulting work has become a growing concern for the executive team." The abrupt change of subject confirmed my suspicions. This was never about efficiency. My consulting work was approved years ago, has never interfered with my duties here, and involves no conflicts of interest, I replied evenly. Preston opened a folder on his desk. "That's where you're wrong. We have evidence suggesting otherwise." He slid several printed emails across the desk. They appeared to be messages from my Vertex account to outside clients, sharing confidential information about investment strategies. My stomach dropped as I scanned them. They were elaborate forgeries. The wording sounded nothing like me, and the dates corresponded with days I had been at industry conferences. "These are fabricated," I said, looking directly at him. "And we both know it. The IT logs say otherwise," Preston replied smoothly. "Your account, your recipients, your breach of confidentiality. The only reason we haven't terminated you already is out of respect for your past contributions." In that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. Preston wasn't just pushing me out, he was setting me up as a scapegoat for whatever compliance violations he was orchestrating. If regulators ever questioned the altered attestations, the trail would lead to the compliance manager who had conflicts of interest and had been leaking company information. I left his office with my mind racing. This wasn't just about my job anymore, it was about my entire career, and possibly even criminal liability. Preston was calculating and methodical, and he clearly had been planning this for months. What he didn't know was that I could be calculating too. And I had something he didn't: the legal obligation of attestation on my side. I spent the weekend developing my strategy. If Preston was creating a paper trail against me, I needed to uncover the real story behind his sudden interest in dismantling compliance. My first call was to a former classmate who now worked at Lambert Financial, Preston's previous employer. "Lisa, I need to know the real story about why Jack Preston left Lambert," I said after swearing her to secrecy. Her hesitation spoke volumes. "It wasn't just restructuring, was it?" I pressed. "I can't say much," Lisa finally replied. "But I suggest you look into their disclosure filings from last spring, the ones right after he left. And Marissa, be careful. People who asked questions after he left suddenly found themselves with performance issues." That information sent me down a rabbit hole of public records and regulatory filings. Lambert had indeed filed a major correction to their previous year's disclosures shortly after Preston's departure, a correction that resulted in a substantial fine for compliance failures. Back at Vertex on Monday, I began quietly building alliances. First was Thomas Weber, our finance director, a methodical numbers man who had been increasingly sidelined in Preston's new regime. "Thomas, have you noticed anything unusual about the financial reporting procedures lately?" I asked casually when we were alone in the break room. His eyes darted around before he answered quietly. "The new reconciliation process bypasses 3 control checks we used to consider mandatory." When I objected, I was told it came from the top and to fall in line. "Did Preston approve that change?" Thomas nodded. He said it was to streamline efficiency. But between us, there's nothing efficient about skipping fraud prevention steps. By Wednesday, I had spoken with 6 department heads, all reporting similar stories: established safeguards bypassed, objections ignored, documentation altered. Preston had systematically dismantled key compliance functions while keeping each department isolated from the others. Caroline continued to be my most valuable ally, though her position required extreme caution. "The board has complete faith in Preston," she confirmed during another off-site lunch. "Amanda has been presenting his changes as revolutionary efficiency improvements that will boost our competitive edge." "And the compliance implications?" Caroline sighed, barely discussed. "When I raise concerns, I'm told that you've reviewed and approved everything." "That's completely false," I said, my voice rising. "Half these changes I've never even seen, and the ones I have, I've explicitly rejected." "I believe you," Caroline said. "But without proof, it's your word against his. And right now, his word carries more weight," I finished for her. The following day, I discovered my security access had been restricted without explanation. I could no longer access certain compliance servers that had always been under my purview. When I emailed IT support, the response was terse. "Access changes requested by executive management." Later that afternoon, Sandra Mills from HR asked to meet me for coffee. Sandra had been with Vertex for 12 years and had always been straight with me. "This is completely unofficial," she said, her voice barely above a whisper in the crowded coffee shop. "But I thought you should know there's a departmental restructuring plan on Preston's desk with your role specifically marked for redefinition. The timeline shows implementation within 30 days. My throat tightened. "Redefinition?" Sandra nodded grimly. Your responsibilities would be distributed to other departments, with overall compliance oversight moving directly under Preston's office. That night, I couldn't sleep. For the first time since this ordeal began, I experienced a full-blown anxiety attack. My chest constricted as I paced my apartment, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. If Preston succeeded in forcing me out while implementing these dangerous compliance shortcuts, what would happen when regulators eventually discovered the violations? With my professional reputation destroyed by his fabricated evidence, I would be the perfect scapegoat. As dawn broke, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, with a New York area code. "Is this Marissa Campbell?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Diana Rodriguez. I was Chief Risk Officer at Meridian Investment Group until last year. We haven't met, but we have something in common. Jack Preston." My pulse quickened. "I'm listening." "Preston was at Meridian before Lambert," Diana explained. "He left under a cloud, though it was all kept very quiet. There was a substantial settlement with regulators that never made the news." "What kind of violation?" "Attestation fraud," Diana said. "Signatures on compliance documents that had been modified after certification. Sound familiar?" It was exactly what was happening at Vertex. Preston wasn't just cutting corners. He had an established pattern of compliance fraud. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because someone warned me when he moved to Lambert, but I stayed silent. By the time the dust settled, 3 colleagues lost their careers and 1 nearly faced criminal charges. I won't make that mistake again." After thanking Diana and taking detailed notes, I sat at my kitchen table feeling simultaneously vindicated and terrified. Preston wasn't just an aggressive cost-cutter. He was a serial compliance manipulator who had developed a sophisticated method for circumventing regulatory requirements while insulating himself from consequences. What I still couldn't understand was why Amanda Graham, our CEO, seemed to support him so completely. Amanda had always been a stickler for compliance and ethical behavior. Had Preston somehow deceived her too? Or was there something I was missing? The answer came later that day through a chance conversation with a board member's executive assistant. She mentioned casually that Amanda and Preston had known each other for years. "Really?" I asked, trying to sound merely curious. "I thought they met during the hiring process." "Oh no," she replied. "They worked together at Keystone Partners way back. Amanda was so excited when she found out he was available. Said it was perfect timing to bring in someone she could trust implicitly. A previous undisclosed business relationship. That explained Preston's rapid rise and apparent untouchability. Amanda wasn't being deceived, she was actively protecting him, possibly blind to what he was really doing because of their prior connection. This revelation changed everything. If the CEO herself was supporting Preston, going through normal channels would be useless. I needed irrefutable evidence and multiple allies if I was going to stop what was happening. As I left the office that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Careful what you're digging into. Preston has friends in places you wouldn't expect." Then, seconds later, this conversation never happened. Someone was watching me. The game had just become significantly more dangerous. The following week brought a new crisis. While reviewing documentation for an upcoming merger with Apex Financial, I discovered serious compliance violations that had been deliberately obscured. The due diligence report had been sanitized, with several red flags about Apex's regulatory history completely removed. More disturbing was what replaced those warnings: falsified attestations claiming thorough reviews had found no issues. Some bore my digital signature, though I had never seen the documents before, much less signed off on them. This wasn't just internal manipulation anymore. Preston was falsifying regulatory submissions that would be filed with federal agencies, a criminal offense. I spent hours cross-referencing the altered reports with the original data we had received from Apex. The discrepancies were significant. Apex had been cited 3 times in the past 2 years for disclosure violations, yet our due diligence report now claimed they had a spotless regulatory record. Even more alarming were the financial projections. Preston had inflated the potential revenue synergies by nearly 40% while understating integration costs. Anyone making investment decisions based on these numbers would be seriously misled. I compiled everything into a secure document, carefully tracking each violation. The quarterly attestation deadline was approaching the point at which I would legally need to certify that Vertex was in compliance with all regulatory requirements. Signing off on these falsified documents would make me personally liable for fraud. The next day, I discovered that Preston had appointed his special advisor Ethan Davis to handle compliance reviews for the merger. Davis, who had no formal compliance training or certifications, would now be responsible for one of the most legally sensitive aspects of the deal. Ethan has extensive experience with merger integration, Preston announced during the project update meeting. Having him lead the compliance review will ensure we maintain velocity toward our closing date. I spoke up immediately. With all due respect, attestation reviews require specialized knowledge of regulatory requirements. Ethan doesn't have that background. Preston's smile was razor-sharp. We value your input, Marissa, but we've determined this is the most efficient approach. Ethan will consult with your team as needed. My team won't be able to support this approach, I replied firmly. Attestation responsibility can't be delegated to someone without proper qualifications. The room fell silent. Challenging Preston publicly was risky, but I needed witnesses to my objection. Perhaps you and I should discuss this privately, Preston said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Before I could respond, Amanda stepped in. Jack's restructuring of the compliance workflow has my full support, she said, not even looking at me. The board is extremely pleased with the direction he's taking us. The old ways were too bureaucratic. Later that day, the board sent out a company-wide announcement praising Preston's leadership and the exciting new direction he was taking Vertex. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. Anyone not on board with Preston's changes was against the company's future. I was running out of time and options. If I refused to sign the quarterly attestation, Preston would have grounds to terminate me immediately. If I signed, I would be legally certifying fraudulent documents. And if I resigned, there would be no one left who understood the full scope of the violations taking place. I needed to speak with Caroline again. As general counsel, she was the only person with enough authority to potentially intervene. The board has no idea about the attestation requirements or what's actually happening, Caroline confirmed when we met secretly at a restaurant 10 blocks from the office. Preston has convinced them that compliance is just bureaucratic red tape that's slowing down our growth. But you're general counsel, I said. Can't you explain the legal implications? Caroline looked exhausted. I've tried. Every time I raise concerns, Preston has a ready explanation about how his new approach actually improves compliance while reducing unnecessary documentation. Amanda backs him completely. The board trusts them, not me. So what can we do? You need to understand what you're up against, Caroline said gravely. This morning, someone accessed your personnel files and compliance records using executive credentials. They're building a case against you, Marissa. My stomach dropped. Who accessed them? The system doesn't show that level of detail. But only 3 people have those credentials. Amanda, Preston, and me. And it wasn't me. The implications were chilling. Either Preston was accelerating his plan to discredit me, or Amanda herself was involved in building the case. Either way, I was quickly running out of time. That evening, I contacted James Foster, a former regulator who now consulted on compliance issues. We had worked together on industry standards committees, and I trusted his judgment. Based on what you're describing, James said after I explained the situation, you have a legal obligation to refuse fraudulent attestation, but doing so will almost certainly result in immediate termination. And if I sign? You could face personal liability if the fraud is discovered, which from what you're telling me seems inevitable. These things always come to light eventually. So I'm damned either way, I said. Not necessarily, James replied. There's a third option. Document everything. Create a comprehensive record of the violations and your objections, then present it all to the board simultaneously with your attestation decision. Make it impossible for them to claim they weren't informed. It was a risky strategy, but it might be my only chance. I began compiling a detailed dossier of all the violations, manipulations, and governance failures I had documented over the past months. The resulting file was over 70 pages long, a devastating record of systematic compliance fraud orchestrated primarily by Preston, but enabled by others throughout the organization. As I finalized the document, a notification popped up on my phone, a calendar invitation for a special board meeting the following afternoon to approve the final terms of the Apex merger. The meeting was scheduled just 4 hours before the quarterly attestation deadline. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Preston was orchestrating events so that by the time the attestation deadline arrived, the merger would be approved, making any compliance objections moot. Once the deal was done, no one would want to reopen it, regardless of what violations might have occurred. I was staring at the notification when another alert came through from the security system. Someone had just accessed the attestation portal using my credentials, though I hadn't logged in. They were making their move, likely planting more falsified documents under my signature. This was it. The confrontation was now inevitable. I had less than 24 hours to prepare for the most important fight of my professional life. The next morning began with a devastating email. Preston had called an emergency department head meeting, where he publicly questioned my competence, suggesting that my divided attention between Vertex and my consulting work had led to significant compliance oversights. According to a sympathetic colleague who attended, Preston presented a series of alleged errors in my work, all fabricated or manipulated, and suggested that the upcoming attestation deadline might require emergency measures to ensure proper certification. By 10 o'clock, I had received a formal warning letter from HR, citing performance issues and potential conflicts of interest. The letter referenced the falsified emails Preston had shown me earlier, now presented as evidence of misconduct. The warning required my signature acknowledging the issues, a trap designed to create documentation of my confession. I refused to sign, instead responding with a detailed rebuttal addressing each false allegation with timestamps and system logs proving the fabrications. I tried to schedule a meeting with Amanda to present my evidence, but her assistant informed me she was in preparation meetings for tomorrow's board presentation and unavailable. This was unprecedented in 5 years. Amanda had never refused to meet with me when compliance issues were involved. Caroline found me in my office around noon, her expression grim. The board knows nothing about the attestation requirements, she confirmed. Preston has convinced them it's just an administrative formality that his team can handle. They have no idea about the legal liability involved. How is that possible? I asked. The attestation requirements are fundamental to our regulatory framework. Most board members come from technology or marketing backgrounds, not finance, Caroline explained. They trust the executive team to handle regulatory details. Preston has exploited that trust. As we were talking, my computer pinged with a security alert. Someone was accessing my private compliance files using executive credentials. They're not even being subtle anymore, I said, showing Caroline the alert. They don't need to be, she replied. Preston has convinced everyone that you're the problem. He's scheduled a special review session with the board immediately before tomorrow's meeting to discuss compliance leadership concerns. You're not invited. I felt sick. He's going to present his case against me without giving me a chance to defend myself. Caroline nodded solemnly. I'll be there, but my influence is limited. Preston has Amanda's complete support, and the board follows her lead. After Caroline left, I received a message from our IT security team. An automated alert had flagged unusual access patterns to the compliance servers. The message was routine. They were simply informing me as department head about potential security issues. But the details were anything but routine. Executive credentials had been used to access and modify attestation documents dating back months, systematic alterations, creating a false compliance history. The security team, not realizing the implications, had helpfully included a log of all the changes. It was the smoking gun. I needed proof that someone at the executive level had been systematically altering compliance documentation. The timestamps matched perfectly with Preston's schedule, and the changes aligned exactly with the falsified metrics he had been presenting. I immediately backed up the security log to multiple secure locations, then reached out to James Foster again for advice. This is significant evidence, James confirmed after reviewing the logs. But presenting it requires extreme caution. If Preston has the influence you describe, he could still spin this against you. What would you recommend? Document your formal attestation decision with a detailed explanation of why you cannot certify compliance. Include the evidence of tampering, but present it as concerning findings you've discovered, rather than direct accusations. Force the board to investigate without making yourself an easy target. That afternoon, I consulted with an outside attorney specializing in whistleblower protections. The law protected employees who reported legitimate regulatory violations, but the protection wasn't absolute. If Preston succeeded in painting me as a disgruntled employee with performance issues, my allegations might be dismissed. Your best protection is irrefutable documentation, the attorney advised. They can dispute your opinions, but they can't argue with timestamps and system logs. I spent hours preparing a comprehensive timeline of all the compliance violations with supporting evidence. The case against Preston was devastating systematic fraud that exposed Vertex to potentially millions in fines and regulatory sanctions. At 5:30, as most employees were leaving, Preston called a company-wide special announcement meeting in the main conference room. Attendance was mandatory. With the entire company watching, Preston unveiled what he called Compliance 2, a streamlined approach that would eliminate bureaucratic obstacles while maintaining regulatory adherence. In reality, it was a complete dismantling of the control systems we had carefully built over years. Change can be difficult, Preston said, looking directly at me in the front row. Some of our team members remain attached to outdated processes that slow our growth and competitive edge. Then came the hammer. Effective immediately, all Attestation authority will transition to the Operations Excellence team, Preston's new department staffed with his hand-picked allies. It was a public execution of my authority. In one announcement, he had stripped me of my primary responsibility without actually firing me. As people filed out after the meeting, Preston approached me. "I need your decision by morning," he said quietly. "Sign off on the quarterly attestation as prepared by my team, or we'll consider it your resignation." "Those documents contain fraudulent information," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Signing would make me complicit in regulatory violations." Preston's smile never reached his eyes. "Then clean out your desk. No one will hire you in this industry once I'm finished. Your reputation won't survive what's coming." He handed me a folder. "These are the attestation documents requiring your signature. I've already drafted the announcement of your resignation, effective tomorrow. The choice is yours, sign by 9 a.m., or we announce your departure." Inside the folder were dozens of falsified compliance certifications, each requiring my digital signature. Signing them would make me personally liable for deliberate regulatory fraud. Not signing would end my career at Vertex, and potentially in the industry if Preston's threats were realized. I returned to my office and locked the door, my hands shaking as I reviewed the documents. They were even worse than I expected. Blatant misrepresentations of our compliance status, falsified audit results, and manufactured risk assessments. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that the truth eventually comes out. Stay strong." I spent most of the night preparing for what would likely be my last day at Vertex Capital. By morning, I had completed my dossier of evidence and secured it in multiple locations. If Preston succeeded in forcing me out, the documentation would ensure the truth eventually came to light. As dawn broke over Chicago, I made my decision. I would not sign the fraudulent attestations, regardless of the personal cost. Some principles were worth fighting for, even if it meant sacrificing the career I had worked so hard to build. I arrived at the office at 7:30, determined to face whatever came with dignity and resolve. The attestation deadline was noon, less than 5 hours away. The board meeting to approve the Apex merger was scheduled for 9, with Preston's special session on compliance leadership concerns immediately beforehand. My inbox contained a reminder about the attestation deadline and a calendar invitation for a 9:30 meeting with HR, clearly scheduled to process my termination after I refused to sign. At 8:15, Caroline called. "Preston is in with the board now. He's presenting a completely distorted picture of the compliance situation and your role in it." "Can you challenge him?" I asked. "I'm trying, but he has Amanda backing every word. They've effectively painted you as obstructionist and out of touch with modern compliance approaches." My heart sank. "What about the merger? Are they discussing the compliance issues there?" "Barely mentioned," Caroline replied. "Preston is characterizing it as fully vetted, with any outstanding items to be addressed post-closing. The board seemed satisfied with that assessment. This was exactly what I had feared. Once the merger was approved, no one would want to reopen compliance questions that might jeopardize the deal. Preston was orchestrating events perfectly to ensure the violations remained buried. At 8:45, my phone rang again. It was Thomas from Finance, speaking in a hushed voice. "Marissa, something's not right with the Apex numbers. I've just seen the final integration plan, and the projected synergies are completely unrealistic. These figures would never survive a proper audit." "Preston provided those projections?" I asked. "Yes, and Amanda personally vouched for them. But they're fiction, Marissa. Someone's cooking the books here." This was escalating beyond compliance violations into potential securities fraud. If Vertex was presenting materially false information to shareholders and regulators about the Apex merger, the consequences could be catastrophic. I thanked Thomas and immediately began searching for documentation of the fraudulent projections. If I could prove intentional misrepresentation to shareholders, it might be enough to halt the entire process. At 9:10, my phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Board voted to approve merger. Preston now presenting attestation plan. No mention of you signing. Claims his team can handle." This didn't make sense. The attestation legally required my signature as the registered compliance officer. Preston couldn't simply bypass that requirement unless he had found a way to remove me from the official registration. At 9:20, another text from Caroline confirmed my suspicion. "Preston just informed board that attestation authority has been transferred to new compliance director effective this morning. Board approved without discussion." New compliance director? I hadn't been fired yet, and no replacement had been announced. How could attestation authority be transferred without my knowledge? The answer came moments later in an email from the Regulatory Affairs Department. "Please be advised that effective immediately, Ethan Davis has been appointed Acting Compliance Director with full attestation authority pending permanent leadership transition." Preston had executed his plan perfectly. He had installed his ally in my position without formally terminating me, effectively cutting me out of the attestation process entirely. The regulatory notification had been processed overnight, making it official before I even arrived at the office. At 9:40, security appeared at my office door. "Miss Campbell, we need you to come with us to HR immediately." This was it, the formal termination I had been expecting. But as I gathered my personal items, my computer pinged with one last alert from the attestation system, a critical regulatory warning that had been suppressed in Preston's reports. The warning was damning. Apex Financial was under active investigation by federal regulators for potential fraud related to their asset valuations, the very core of their business. Preston had deliberately concealed this information from the board and from regulatory filings. This wasn't just a compliance oversight. It was a deliberate attempt to hide material information that would have likely killed the merger. If Vertex completed the acquisition without disclosing this investigation, the company would inherit the liability and potentially face charges of deliberate concealment. I quickly downloaded the warning and supporting documentation, adding it to my evidence file. This was the final piece I needed, proof that Preston had knowingly and deliberately concealed information that could expose Vertex to criminal liability. As security escorted me to HR, I texted Caroline. "Emergency. Fed investigation of Apex concealed from board. Check attestation system warning ID number AT7734. Must stop merger immediately." Sandra from HR was waiting with a termination letter, citing performance issues and failure to adapt to strategic changes. The letter had clearly been prepared in advance, expecting my refusal to sign the fraudulent attestations. "Before I sign this," I said calmly, "I need to inform you that I've discovered evidence of potential securities fraud related to the Apex merger. Federal regulations require me to report this to appropriate authorities." Sandra's expression shifted from procedural to concerned. "What kind of evidence?" "Documentation showing that material information about an active federal investigation of Apex was deliberately concealed from the board and from regulatory filings. I've just forwarded this information to Caroline as General Counsel." Sandra's phone rang almost immediately. After a brief conversation, her face paled. "You're to report to the executive conference room immediately. The termination meeting is postponed." As we walked to the conference room, My phone showed it was 11:59, 1 minute before the attestation deadline. The diligence portal would be registering whether the required attestations had been filed. When I entered the conference room, the scene was chaos. Caroline was standing at the head of the table, laptop open, addressing the full board with Amanda and Preston seated nearby. Preston's face was ashen. As I was just explaining to the board, Caroline said as I entered, "We have a significant regulatory issue that requires immediate attention. Miss Campbell has identified documentation indicating that material information about Apex Financial was deliberately withheld from board consideration and from regulatory filings." The board chairman, William Hargrove, turned to me. "Is this true, Miss Campbell?" "Yes, sir. The attestation system flagged an active federal investigation of Apex that was suppressed in the due diligence reports presented to the board. I have the documentation here." As I connected my laptop to the display system, the room fell silent. The evidence was undeniable: multiple instances where Preston had deliberately removed warnings about Apex from reports, including the federal investigation notification. "Who is responsible for this?" Hargrove demanded. Before anyone could respond, a chime sounded from multiple devices around the room. The attestation deadline had passed. Caroline checked her phone, then looked up gravely. "The diligence portal shows no attester of record. The quarterly attestations have not been filed." "That's impossible," Preston interjected. "Davis was authorized this morning." "Actually," Caroline said, "the authorization requires board approval and a 10-day notification period to regulators. The expedited process you attempted was invalid. The only authorized attestation officer remains Miss Campbell." The room erupted in confused questions. Missing the attestation deadline triggered automatic regulatory notifications and potential penalties. Vertex was now officially in violation of its regulatory requirements. Caroline raised her hand for silence. More concerning is the question Mr. Hargrove just asked. Who is responsible for concealing this information about Apex? All eyes turned to Preston, who was frantically typing on his phone. "I think I can answer that," I said, pulling up the system logs showing executive credential access to the compliance servers. These logs show systematic alteration of compliance documents dating back 6 months, all using executive credentials. "That doesn't prove anything," Preston snapped. "Multiple people have executive access." "True," I acknowledged. "But when we cross-reference the access times with building security logs and calendar records, only one executive was present in the building during all these modifications." The evidence was irrefutable. Preston had personally altered compliance documentation, concealed material information from the board, and attempted to force fraudulent attestations. As the reality sank in, Amanda finally spoke. "Jack assured me that he was streamlining unnecessary bureaucracy, not bypassing essential controls." "And you believed him without verification?" Hargrove asked incredulously. "Did you know about the Apex investigation?" Amanda's silence was damning. Caroline addressed the board directly. "We have a legal obligation to disclose these findings to regulators immediately. The merger approval must be rescinded pending a complete investigation." "What about the missed attestation deadline?" another board member asked. "That's potentially the most serious, immediate issue," Caroline confirmed. "Without valid attestation, our regulatory status is compromised. We need to file an emergency extension request with a full explanation." Hargrove turned to me. "Miss Campbell, as the authorized attestation officer, what do you recommend?" 5 minutes earlier, I had been on my way to termination. Now the future of the company rested on my response. "I recommend immediate full disclosure to regulators of both the missed attestation and the concerns regarding Apex," I said firmly. "We should request an emergency extension based on the discovery of potentially fraudulent documentation and initiate a third-party audit of all compliance processes." Hargrove nodded gravely. "I agree. And Mr. Preston's status?" "Suspended pending investigation would be the standard protocol," Caroline replied. Preston stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Everything I did was to streamline inefficient processes and accelerate growth. Campbell has been undermining progress for months with her outdated approach." "Is concealing a federal investigation of an acquisition target your idea of streamlining?" Hargrove asked coldly. As Preston stammered a response, I felt a strange sense of calm. The truth was finally emerging, and with it, the vindication I had fought so hard to achieve. The road ahead would be challenging regulatory investigations, potential penalties, a cancelled merger, but integrity had prevailed. In that moment, I realized that sometimes protecting what matters requires the courage to stand alone against overwhelming pressure. The attestation that Preston had tried to force me to abandon had become the very thing that exposed his fraud. The reckoning had only just begun. The 48 hours following the boardroom confrontation were the most intense of my professional life. External counsel was brought in immediately to conduct an independent investigation, and I spent countless hours walking them through the evidence I had compiled. The findings were even more damning than I had initially realized. Preston had established a pattern of compliance manipulation dating back to his very first month at Vertex, gradually dismantling safeguards while creating a paper trail designed to shift responsibility to others, primarily me. More disturbing was what emerged about his history. The investigation revealed that Preston had left his 2 previous positions amid similar circumstances, compliance failures that were discovered shortly after his departure, with convenient scapegoats left behind to take the blame. 1 week after the confrontation, the board called an emergency meeting to address the findings and determine next steps. I sat quietly as Hargrove summarized the external counsel's preliminary report. "The evidence is conclusive," he stated grimly. Jack Preston engaged in systematic compliance fraud that exposed Vertex to potentially catastrophic regulatory and legal consequences. Had the Apex merger proceeded, we would have acquired a company under active federal investigation for fraud, potentially making us accessories to their violations. The board voted unanimously to terminate Preston immediately. Amanda, whose close relationship with Preston had blinded her to his manipulations, offered her resignation, which the board accepted with reluctance. "We also owe Miss Campbell a formal apology," Hargrove continued, turning to me. "You demonstrated extraordinary courage and integrity in the face of calculated intimidation. Your actions quite literally saved this company from disaster." The apology was appreciated but secondary to the practical questions that remained. Vertex still faced serious regulatory challenges resulting from the compliance failures and the missed attestation deadline. Moving forward, I explained to the board, we need to implement a complete compliance reset. That means full disclosure to regulators, a comprehensive audit of all attestations from the past year, and rebuilding our compliance framework with stronger safeguards against manipulation. "What kind of penalties are we looking at?" one board member asked nervously. "If we self-report immediately and demonstrate good faith through comprehensive remediation, the penalties should be manageable," I explained. "The alternative, waiting for regulators to discover these issues themselves, would be far more costly, both financially and reputationally." The board unanimously approved my proposed approach, and then Hargrove cleared his throat. "There's one more matter to address," he said. "We need a new chief compliance officer who can lead us through this challenging period. The board would like to offer you that position, Miss Campbell, with expanded authority and direct board reporting lines." The promotion was unexpected but logical. No one else understood the compliance issues as thoroughly as I did, and the board clearly recognized the value of the integrity I had demonstrated. "I'm honored by the offer," I replied carefully, "but I would need assurances that compliance will never again be subordinated to growth targets or efficiency initiatives." "Absolutely," Hargrove confirmed. "In fact, we're proposing a governance change that would give the CCO position direct board reporting authority independent of the CEO. Your integrity would be structurally protected." I accepted the position, and the real work began. Over the next month, we conducted a comprehensive compliance overhaul. Every attestation from the previous year was reviewed and, where necessary, amended with corrected information. We self-reported all violations to regulatory authorities with detailed remediation plans. The new attestation system I designed included multiple independent checkpoints and verification requirements. No single executive, not even the CEO, could override compliance controls without multiple approvals and documentation. Perhaps most importantly, we implemented a robust whistleblower protection program that provided safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. The program included direct board access for serious allegations and third-party review of any adverse actions against employees who reported concerns. As we rebuilt, I reconnected with the colleagues who had supported me through the ordeal. Thomas from finance became a key ally in designing financial compliance controls. Caroline, who had been named interim CEO pending a permanent replacement, worked closely with me to ensure compliance considerations were integrated into all strategic decisions. 6 months after Preston's departure, Vertex had emerged stronger and more resilient. The regulatory penalties, while substantial, were far less severe than they could have been thanks to our proactive approach and comprehensive remediation. My evening consulting practice evolved as well. With the board's explicit approval, I began helping other companies identify and address similar compliance vulnerabilities. The experience I had gained through confronting Preston's fraud proved invaluable to organizations seeking to strengthen their own governance frameworks. 1 year after the confrontation in the boardroom, I was invited to speak at a national compliance conference about the experience. As I prepared my remarks, I reflected on the journey and the lessons it had taught me. Integrity is not simply a personal virtue, it's a professional obligation that sometimes requires extraordinary courage. The systems we build to ensure compliance are only as strong as the people who operate them. And sometimes, standing alone for what's right is the only option, regardless of the personal cost. The attestation that Preston had tried to force me to abandon had become the very instrument of justice. By understanding its true purpose not as bureaucratic paperwork but as a personal commitment to truth and accountability, I had found the strength to resist pressure that might otherwise have been overwhelming. As I concluded my presentation at the conference, I shared the most important lesson of all. Compliance isn't about checking boxes or filing forms. It's about creating a culture where doing the right thing isn't just encouraged, but expected even when, especially when, it's difficult. The signature on an attestation isn't just ink on paper, it's your personal commitment to integrity. And that's something no one can take from you unless you surrender it willingly. The audience rose in applause, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that the systems I had built at Vertex were now protecting the company, its employees, and its shareholders from the kind of fraud Preston had attempted. The new CEO, selected for her demonstrated commitment to ethical leadership, had embraced the compliance framework as a competitive advantage rather than a burden. In the end, the legal attestation that Preston had tried to force me to compromise became the cornerstone of a stronger, more resilient organization. Sometimes the things others seek to use against us become our greatest strengths, if only we have the courage to stand firm when it matters most. Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for what's right seemed impossible against overwhelming pressure? What gave you the strength to persist? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more content about integrity in professional settings, and share with anyone who might be facing similar challenges. Thank you for listening, and remember, your signature, whether literal or figurative, is your bond. Protect it at all costs.